I never imagined a simple family dinner could expose every truth I had tried to ignore for years. It was the kind of night that forced me to finally see my place in this family for what it truly was. My name is Meredith, and I was sitting at the same table where I had poured my time, my effort, and my savings, including the $59,000 they begged me to use to save the restaurant. Dad set his fork down and delivered the sentence that cut through the room with stunning precision, a sentence he spoke only days after using my money to pull their business out of collapse. No one needs your money, or you anymore. The air did not shift. Mom kept eating as if the words were nothing. My sister lifted her glass with a satisfied look, claiming the restaurant's recovery as her personal victory, while acting as if my sacrifice had never happened. I kept my posture steady even though a heat tightened across my chest. Their certainty told me they believed the power had fully shifted in their favor, yet they had no idea how long I had been preparing for this exact moment. I watched them rewrite the truth, take credit for what they never built, and dismiss everything I had carried, and I understood that staying silent would be the sharpest choice I could make. My silence that night was not surrender. It was the beginning, and by sunrise they would finally learn who truly needed whom. If you want to hear how everything unraveled after that dinner, and why those words ended up costing them far more than they expected, stay with me until the end, because this story speaks for anyone who has ever been pushed aside by the people they fought hardest to help. A call from Mom came late in the afternoon, and the tension in her voice made my stomach tighten before she even explained what was happening. I drove to the BBQ restaurant owned by my parents and walked into a space that had once been filled with noise and confidence, yet now felt drained of its identity. The chairs were stacked unevenly, the lights dimmer than usual, and the fatigue etched on my parents' faces told me the truth before any paperwork did. Dad sat behind the counter with piles of overdue invoices spread across the surface. He pushed a stack of documents toward me, and I scanned the numbers that showed how dangerously close the restaurant was to shutting down. His tone carried a weight I rarely heard. "You are our last hope." The sentence pressed on me harder than the columns of debt ever could. I asked Mom whether my sister Erin could help in any way, hoping she might share part of the responsibility. Mom shook her head and insisted that Erin was dealing with her own issues. Erin appeared a moment later, still in her pajamas, and asked Mom what she planned to cook for dinner without even acknowledging the growing crisis. Mom comforted Erin and looked at me with an expectation that left no room for refusal. I needed space to think, so I met my best friend Calvin at a quiet cafe near our old school. Calvin listened to every detail while trying to keep his expression neutral, though I could sense his concern. He reminded me of all the times I had stepped in for my family without receiving much recognition. Calvin said I should consider how this decision might drain me again, and he asked whether I wanted to repeat the same cycle. His words were reasonable, yet a part of me still believed that helping now might finally shift how my parents saw me. That evening, I returned to the restaurant. Dad handed me additional bills, each one reflecting the same urgent story. Mom stood beside him with a mix of desperation and relief, as if my presence alone signaled a solution. Erin walked by again and commented on how exhausting her day had been, even though she had not contributed to anything related to the business. Mom brushed her hair gently and whispered something reassuring before turning to me with hopeful eyes. My parents watched me closely as I read through the last document. The truth was plain to see. The restaurant would not survive without immediate intervention. I took a slow breath and agreed to help. I told them I would cover the debt, which totaled $59,000, but I wanted a written financial agreement to ensure transparency. Mom nodded with almost frantic eagerness, and Dad said it was unnecessary, but agreed anyway, mostly because he knew they had no alternative. I read the contract twice before signing, making sure the clause I added would protect me if things went wrong. I did not reveal the details of that clause, and they did not ask. My parents were too relieved to question why I insisted on a formal document. To them, the crisis seemed to fade the moment I picked up the pen. They thanked me repeatedly with emotions that felt more like desperation than gratitude. As I left the restaurant with the agreement in my bag, I felt a cautious sense of hope. I believed that stepping in might finally show my place in the family, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to imagine that this sacrifice would change something meaningful. Yet even then, a quiet unease lingered beneath the surface, hinting that the future would not unfold the way I hoped. A few weeks after the debt was cleared, the restaurant moved with a pace that reminded me why people in this town loved our food during better years. I arrived before sunrise to handle the first deliveries, and I often stayed until the last receipt printed because every system had to be rebuilt after months of neglect. I managed the kitchen rotation, the scheduling, the overtime approvals, the vendor calls, the weekly transfers, and the constant stream of customer feedback, which came faster than I expected once the smell of steady business spread around the neighborhood again. The pressure exhausted me on some days, yet there was a strange clarity in seeing the place breathe rather than choke under unpaid bills. The momentum grew even stronger by the second week, when lines stretched through the doorway during lunch hours. Mom handled the register with an energy I had not seen in months, although she occasionally glanced toward Aaron, who began showing up at unpredictable times. Erin walked through the kitchen with a clipboard she never wrote on, and she lingered beside conversations she had never been part of when the restaurant struggled. Her presence tilted the air in a way that forced me to step aside, so she would not accuse me of shutting her out. She smiled at customers as if she had worked during the difficult stretch, then followed me into the office without being invited to observe my progress on payroll. Mom and Dad praised Erin whenever customers complimented the food or the service. They talked about her dedication, her leadership instincts, and her vision for the menu, even though she had not offered a single suggestion when the bank threatened foreclosure. I listened without interrupting because my energy needed to stay focused on keeping the system stable instead of correcting their version of history. Erin nodded at every compliment as if it confirmed something she had believed about herself for years, while I typed quietly to avoid providing a reaction that could be twisted into resentment. I noticed subtle changes inside the office during the following days. Meetings that used to include me suddenly happened behind the closed door of the storage room. Vendors called to confirm decisions I had not heard about. The weekly budget sheets were revised by someone else, then placed on my desk without explanation. The pattern repeated enough times for me to understand it was not a mistake. Erin was becoming the center of their planning, even though she had no experience handling the financial rebuild. Her confidence grew with every whisper they shared away from me, and she began correcting my decisions in front of newer employees who had joined after the crisis ended. Dad dismissed my questions when I tried to clarify the changes, telling me he trusted Erin's fresh perspective. The phrase settled in my mind with an uneasy weight because it echoed the shift I felt in every corner of the restaurant. I adjusted my approach by creating distance wherever possible, which allowed me to observe without inviting conflict. The distance protected my focus, and it also revealed how eager Erin had become to mirror authority she never earned. She monitored small tasks that once belonged to my daily routine, then reported her observations to Mom with a quiet confidence that suggested she expected Mom to agree with her assessments. During this time, I kept working in a quiet rhythm that preserved the stability of the place, while avoiding direct arguments. I tracked every change carefully and documented each shift in responsibility, not to confront anyone immediately, but to understand how far they planned to push me out. The constant reassignments showed a version of the truth I had tried to ignore when the debt crisis first began. I realized I had to protect myself long before the final blow arrived at the dinner table, because the warning signs were already here, woven into every decision they made without me. By the end of that month, I sensed a shift forming before anyone said a word, although I tried to stay focused on the operations that still needed attention. The restaurant felt different in a way that suggested decisions had been made without consulting me, yet I waited for my parents to speak, rather than assume what direction they intended to take. Their announcement arrived during a quiet moment in the office, when Mom folded her arms with an expression that almost resembled sympathy. She said Erin would start managing the place for a while because they did not want me to exhaust myself after everything I had done. Dad supported her with a nod, adding that Erin possessed a natural leadership style the business could benefit from as it entered a stronger phase. The words landed with a dull heaviness, not because I feared being replaced, but because their tone hinted at a conclusion they had already reached behind closed doors. Erin entered the office a few seconds later with a bright confidence that revealed she knew about the decision long before I heard it. She explained her plan for a new operating model that included extended shifts, revised scheduling protocols, and a menu adjustment she believed would modernize the restaurant. Her voice carried a rehearsed certainty that made the proposal sound like a performance she had been waiting to deliver. I listened carefully to identify the practical gaps, yet Erin interpreted my silence as an invitation to take control with greater enthusiasm. Employees soon approached me with concerns that Erin pushed them beyond reasonable limits, especially when she required longer prep cycles without considering the physical strain on the kitchen staff. Several described moments when Erin corrected them abruptly in front of customers, which created tension that spread through the team faster than I expected. I continued observing quietly, because responding defensively would only provide Erin with a reason to portray me as resistant to improvement. Erin escalated her involvement by reviewing sections of the financial log she had barely glanced at during the crisis, then inserting notes that contradicted the legitimate records I had maintained for months. The situation grew heavier when I realized she had modified certain entries instead of verifying them. The changes were subtle enough to appear like clerical corrections, yet precise enough to shift responsibility for specific high-cost orders away from decisions she recently made and toward earlier dates. I studied her adjustments in silence because confronting her prematurely would only make her assume authority she had not earned. She noticed me reviewing the ledger one afternoon and delivered a soft remark that carried more bite than volume. Erin said she needed everything organized properly now that she was stepping into a formal role. Her eyes lingered on me long enough to imply that she believed the numbers should reflect her version of order rather than the truth recorded during the rebuild. Mom praised Erin later that day, telling a server that the restaurant finally had real direction under Erin's guidance. Dad echoed the sentiment with a comment about Erin's steady instincts, which left an aftertaste more revealing than they intended. Their approval grew louder as the week continued, while my contributions faded from their conversations as if they belonged to a distant chapter. I continued working with an even rhythm that allowed me to track the changes without revealing how closely I was monitoring each shift in authority. Erin walked with a heightened confidence that bordered on entitlement, and the staff began treating me carefully because they sensed the power balance shifting in ways they did not fully understand. During a quiet night in the office after the dinner rush, I retrieved the financial agreement I had signed at the beginning of the crisis. The paper felt heavier than I remembered as I unfolded it to review the clause I had included for my protection. The clause did not solve everything yet. It reminded me that I had prepared for the possibility that gratitude would fade once stability returned. I read it slowly, realizing I might need to act sooner than I planned because the signs of decline were already taking shape in Erin's decisions and in my parents' eagerness to let her reshape everything they had allowed me to rebuild. Then came that dinner, the one where everyone acted as if the past weeks had been perfectly ordinary. Mom arranged the dishes with forced cheerfulness, while Dad leaned back in his seat with a calmness that suggested everything in his world was finally under control. Erin sat across from me with her usual confident posture, swirling her wine like she was celebrating a victory only she understood. The room carried a strange brightness, as though the tension sitting between us had been neatly folded and tucked under the table. I took my seat, and immediately sensed that something rehearsed was about to unfold. Mom asked a few casual questions about operations at the restaurant, questions she already knew the answers to because she had discussed them with Aaron long before this dinner. I was no longer invited to those conversations, and everyone at the table seemed comfortable pretending that fact no longer mattered. Erin began listing what she called this month's accomplishments, though the only thing I heard was the erasure of my work. She went through every improvement I had made since the debt was cleared, presenting each step as her own idea, her own initiative, her own talent. She spoke with a confidence she had never possessed before the day I paid $59,000 to save the restaurant from shutting down. Mom nodded at every point Erin made. Dad added approving comments about Erin's natural leadership, offering them with the tone of someone announcing a promotion. I watched their faces with a strange sense of detachment, as if I was seeing them from outside my own life. Erin glanced at me with a smile sharp enough to cut through the air, a silent acknowledgement that she had stepped into a position she believed now belonged entirely to her. The charade could have stretched on longer, but Dad decided the evening needed a conclusion. He placed his glass on the table with deliberate precision, looked directly at me, and spoke the sentence that would sever the last thread holding us together. "No one needs your money, or you anymore." The words settled heavily into the room. Mom didn't blink. Erin didn't flinch. They reacted as if this declaration had been planned and agreed upon long before I walked in the door. Erin leaned forward slightly, her voice smooth. "The restaurant is thriving because of me, not you." Her confidence was absolute. Mom didn't object. Dad didn't correct her. They accepted the rewritten version of reality without hesitation, a version where I didn't exist in the story of their recovery. I looked at Erin for a long moment, then at Mom and Dad. None of them met my gaze with an ounce of recognition for what I had done. They didn't mention the sacrifices. They didn't mention the long nights. They didn't mention the money that kept their doors open. It was as if my contribution had been wiped clean from their memories. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. Hard experience had taught me that arguing in this family only made the truth disappear faster. Silence revealed more than any confrontation could. In that silence, I read every motive, every shift in loyalty, every hidden agreement that they assumed I was too blind to see. Dinner carried on around me, but I withdrew from the rhythm of their conversation. I watched the way Erin described future plans for her restaurant. I watched the way Mom indulged it. I watched the way Dad supported it. And I realized the betrayal had been completed long before this dinner. When the meal finally ended, I stood up slowly, feeling a resolve I had never known before. If they no longer needed me, they were about to learn what that truly meant. I would take action that very night. The next morning, I woke up with a strange clarity, as if every emotion from the night before had settled just enough to make room for an irreversible decision. I left the house earlier than usual and drove to the bank with the mindset of someone who no longer owed anything to people, who had dismissed every contribution I ever made. The atmosphere in the lobby carried just the right amount of seriousness to keep me steady for what I was about to do. At the consultation desk, I met the financial advisor who had helped me draft the investment terms back when I paid off the restaurant's debts. His role was always to assess risk and ensure every one of my financial decisions followed proper compliance. He recognized me the moment I said my name and asked which clause I intended to activate. The way he looked at me made it clear he knew this wasn't a routine visit. I told him to officially stop all automatic payments flowing from my account into the restaurant's system. There was no hesitation. A few confirmations later, the cash flow returned to its rightful owner, me. He informed me that the recurring transactions had been locked, and any future payments would have to come directly from whoever was legally running the restaurant. Then I requested the cancellation of all supplier credit lines I had set up to stabilize their inventory during the recovery phase. It meant vendors would no longer rely on my account for invoice clearance. Every order would now have to go through the restaurant system without any of the safety nets I once put in place. The advisor documented my request thoroughly, confirming the cancellation would take effect immediately. When he asked whether I wanted to withdraw my capital, I handed him the agreement and pointed to the clause that allowed full retrieval if transparency within the partnership was compromised. He reread the section, nodded, and told me I had every right as long as I submitted the request in writing. I signed the withdrawal form and watched him file it into the system. That transaction wasn't just financial procedure. It was the moment I severed myself from an environment that no longer gave me even the bare minimum of respect. As I walked out of the bank, my phone buzzed non-stop with alerts from the restaurant's management system. I didn't need to open them to know what they said. Erin had definitely seen the one notification she never expected to encounter: payment failed. I could almost picture her face, the confusion, the sudden loss of control, so far from the smug arrogance she flaunted at dinner the night before. Mom and Dad would probably assume it was a technical glitch. They always believed things ran smoothly because the universe was simply kind to them, never realizing it was me quietly keeping everything together. Today, they'd finally witness what happens when trust is replaced with entitlement. I didn't look back as I left the bank. I didn't need to. I had just activated the clause they never bothered to read. 1 week later, the consequences of every decision they had dismissed finally arrived, with a weight no one in my family knew how to carry. I woke up to a string of unread messages from the restaurant supplier, each one increasingly urgent and all of them saying the same thing. The company could not send any further shipments because the outstanding balance had exceeded the allowed threshold. The email copied both Mom and Dad, and it spelled out the numbers with a clarity that left no space for excuses. The missing payments had triggered a hold, and the restaurant no longer met the requirements to place new orders. By noon, Erin attempted to push through the day with the limited ingredients left in storage while pretending the situation was manageable. Customers arrived expecting the usual menu, but the kitchen lacked half of the essentials, which created a churn of frustration that spread across the dining room. People turned around at the door when they were told their favorite dishes were unavailable, and some questioned whether the place had changed ownership. I watched from a distance as the restaurant's online reviews shifted downward within hours. The staff, already exhausted from Erin's new schedules, began to resign in clusters. One cook told her he refused to continue when she expanded shifts without approval. Another employee confronted her privately after discovering that payroll had been delayed again. Erin pushed back with the brittle confidence of someone who believed authority came from volume rather than competence. Her reactions grew more frantic every time an employee submitted a resignation email. Within 48 hours, the team was reduced to a fraction of what the restaurant required to operate. The collapse accelerated when Erin attempted to handle a dinner rush with inexperienced temporary workers she had called at the last minute. She snapped at a server in front of a full dining room, blaming him for a spilled drink that was clearly caused by her own chaotic instructions. A group of customers stood up and left after witnessing the exchange. Someone recorded her outburst, and a short clip appeared online labeled with the restaurant name. The post spread quickly among locals, and the damage multiplied. Mom and Dad tried to stabilize the situation by calling every contact they had saved over the years. They reached out to former employees, cousins, distant acquaintances, and even old customers who worked in distribution, hoping someone could bypass the supplier's hold. Every call ended the same way. Without updated payments, nothing could be processed. The limits I had deactivated remained locked, and the financial door they had relied on for months no longer existed. They attempted to reach me next. Mom left a long message asking me to help just this once. Dad sent several short texts insisting the issue was temporary, and that the restaurant only needed a small bridge to stay afloat. Erin wrote last, trying to shift the tone by suggesting that I should act like family. I read their messages without responding. The silence felt cleaner than any explanation I could offer. They had drawn their line at that dinner table, and I had finally learned how to draw mine. The calls intensified over the next 2 days. They asked to meet in person, promising to talk things out calmly. I declined without hesitation because I no longer intended to stand in the same room where blame had been disguised as expectation. They pushed again, this time urging me to visit the restaurant to see the damage myself. I refused that suggestion as well. The situation was clear enough without witnessing the collapse in person. By the end of the week, the restaurant had reached a standstill. With no supplies, no staff, and no functioning management system, the place closed its doors indefinitely. Erin avoided all contact after realizing no one could absorb the consequences for her mistakes. Mom and Dad tried to salvage whatever pride they had left, but the truth sat between them with a weight that could no longer be ignored. I did not interfere. I did not explain. I simply let the structure they defended so fiercely fall in the exact way it had been built. A few weeks after the restaurant closed, the silence around my family felt heavier than any confrontation we had ever had. It settled into every unanswered call, every message that no longer arrived, and every space where accusations used to fill the air with heat. For the first time in years, I watched distance form without resistance, and I let it grow because it was the only thing that finally made sense. My parents tried to keep the disaster hidden at first, but reality never cooperates with pride. When the suppliers demanded payment in full, they were forced to sell furniture equipment and even the old truck my father always swore he would keep forever. There were days when neighbors watched buyers carry items out of the garage while Mom stood in the doorway with a face drained of color. Neither of them called me to complain or ask for advice. The silence between us carried a message they finally understood, but never admitted. Erin tried to escape the fallout through confidence she no longer had the position to support. She applied to every management role within driving distance, yet every interview ended the same. Former employees shared their experiences, and the reputation she thought she had built dissolved faster than she expected. She stopped posting about her leadership journey online, and even her closest friends quietly stepped back once they realized the story behind the restaurant's collapse. I never celebrated her downfall, though I recognized it as the natural consequence of choices she refused to own. One afternoon, I packed my things without fanfare and left Texas behind. I chose a city where no one knew my family name, where I could walk into a job without people whispering about the restaurant, where I could start my days without preparing myself for someone else's crisis. The first night in my new apartment, I realized the quiet no longer felt threatening. It felt earned. I understood that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the absence of people who expected me to sacrifice myself to maintain their comfort. My parents never apologized, and I never asked them to. The distance made the expectations they once placed on me disappear, and I learned that I did not need closure from people who had no intention of offering it. Erin sent a single message asking if I was willing to talk things out for the sake of the family, but I chose not to respond because I no longer believed that loyalty meant returning to places that refused to value me. Cutting ties did not feel cruel. It felt necessary. I built new routines, new friendships, and new goals that were finally my own. The weight I carried for years dissolved slowly each morning. I woke up without waiting for the next request, the next crisis, or the next reminder that my worth had always been conditional in their eyes. By stepping away, I reclaimed a future they never thought I would choose for myself. There are moments in life when protecting your own peace becomes more important than preserving broken loyalty. I learned that love without respect will drain you until you forget who you are, and that boundaries are not cruelty, but a form of survival. Walking away from people who refuse accountability is not betrayal. It is self-rescue. Healing begins the moment you choose yourself, even when it means letting go of the family you once tried so hard to save. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. Your time and empathy mean more than you know, and I truly appreciate every listener who reflects on these experiences with an open heart. If this journey made you think about loyalty, boundaries, or self-worth, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might help someone else who is trying to find their own strength. I used to believe family gatherings were predictable, filled with polite smiles and empty compliments, until one evening proved me completely wrong in the most humiliating way imaginable. My name is Eden Grant, and 2 weeks ago I thought my life in Los Angeles had finally reached balance. After years of working 16-hour days, I was promoted to marketing director, and the first thing I did was buy myself a Tesla, my one personal reward for everything I had built from nothing. When my mother invited me to her 60th birthday celebration at the Los Angeles Event Hall, I said yes, without hesitation. It felt like the right time to reconnect to celebrate her milestone, surrounded by family and old friends. Over 50 guests filled the room that night, each holding a glass of champagne as music played softly behind the chatter. My father stood near the center talking about business while my brother laughed at every compliment tossed his way. They fit perfectly into the crowd, confident, comfortable, admired. I sat at the corner table, smiling when necessary, trying not to think about how invisible I felt. The lights dimmed slightly as Mom stepped forward with a microphone in hand. Her voice, calm and proud, carried across the hall. Tonight, she said, my daughter Eden will give her Tesla to her brother as a gift. The room froze. I felt 50 pairs of eyes turn toward me, waiting for approval. I stood, my pulse hammering, and said firmly, "That's not happening." Dad moved first. His hand struck my face with a sound so sharp the music stopped. My earring hit the floor, rolling somewhere beneath the tables. I wiped my lip, lifted my chin, and walked out, while the whispers followed behind me. If your family tried to humiliate you like that in front of everyone, would you stay silent or walk away like I did? Tell me what you would have done. A week before the party, I almost believed we were a normal family. It had been years since we all sat down together without tension or judgment, and when Mom called to invite me, her voice sounded almost gentle. For a moment, I thought maybe things were changing. But that hope was short-lived. Just like every other time, I believed she saw me as more than the daughter who didn't need help. Growing up, Mom always defended my brother Ryan no matter what he did. When he broke Dad's favorite watch, she said it was an accident. When he failed his classes, she blamed his teachers. When he crashed his first car, she said he was under too much pressure. And when he lost another job, she sighed and said, "He just needs another chance." I learned early that love in our house came with rules, and those rules never seemed to include me. Dad's version of fairness was even simpler. He said that men deserved more room to stumble because the world was harder on them. I used to wonder what world he lived in, because in mine, I had to be twice as good to be noticed at all. I worked my way through college, sometimes taking 2 jobs just to pay rent. I skipped vacations, turned down dinners, and built a career brick by brick until I finally got promoted. The day I drove my Tesla home, the one I had dreamed of since I was a teenager, the driveway was empty. No one came outside. No one asked to see it. When I walked in, Mom didn't even look up from her phone. "That's nice, dear," she said, then started talking about Ryan's new idea to start a podcast. Ryan, who still lived off Mom's credit card, smiled like he had earned something too. It wasn't anger I felt that day. It was quiet, heavy disbelief that no matter how far I climbed, I would always be the one standing alone. The irony was that I never blamed Ryan for taking advantage of the comfort he was given. I blamed the people who built the cushion for him to fall on again and again, while expecting me to land on concrete. Mom said I was lucky to be independent. She said Ryan just hadn't found himself yet. I wanted to ask her how long that search was supposed to take, but I had learned to save my words. Nothing I said ever changed anything. Then one afternoon, a cream envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was the invitation to Mom's 60th birthday. The gold lettering shimmered under the light, and for a second I smiled. Maybe this was a chance to reconnect. Maybe we could finally sit together without the unspoken comparisons. I even bought a new dress, something simple but elegant, because I wanted to believe there could be peace for one night. I told myself it didn't matter if no one noticed me, that I was there to celebrate Mom, not prove anything. But deep down, I wanted her to look at me and feel proud for once. I had no idea that the night I planned to honor her would be the same night she would humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. That evening, light music played softly in the background, and for a brief moment the room felt like a family again. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt until Mom cleared her throat and asked everyone to quiet down. She smiled the kind of smile she used whenever she was about to make a performance out of something. "Tonight," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone, "I want to make a special announcement. My daughter Eden will hand her Tesla to her brother Ryan as a symbol of family love and support." The sound of forks against plates stopped instantly. The laughter froze. It was as if the air itself had turned to glass. Every pair of eyes at the table turned toward me, waiting for my reaction. I could feel the weight of 50 strangers measuring the worth of my silence. My pulse beat in my ears, but I forced my voice to stay calm. "That's not going to happen." The words came out even steady, too quiet at first, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Dad's chair scraped against the floor. He stood, his face flushed, red veins visible at his temples. I could tell by the way his hand tightened that this was not going to end with words. "Eden," he said, his tone low and dangerous, "you will do as your mother says." I didn't move. He stepped closer. For a second I thought he might stop, that pride would keep him from making a scene in front of their friends. But then his hand struck across my face hard enough that the sound echoed. The sting came before the shock. I felt the room tilt slightly and my earring slipped loose, hitting the floor somewhere near the stage. No one spoke. Someone gasped quietly. The silence that followed was worse than the slap itself. Ryan lowered his head but said nothing. The guests held their phones halfway in the air, uncertain whether to keep recording or pretend they hadn't. I saw flashes. Some had already started filming before the blow landed. Mom froze, her hand gripping the microphone so tightly her knuckles went white. She didn't step forward. She didn't tell Dad to stop. Her lips parted, but no words came out. That was the moment I realized this wasn't shock, it was choice. I straightened slowly, feeling the burn still spreading across my cheek. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. Instead, I reached for my clutch, found my phone, and walked toward the exit. Behind me, people began whispering again, their voices blending into a low hum. The sound followed me down the hall, sharp and cold, like static. Outside, the air was cooler. I stepped onto the pavement, my hand shaking slightly as I scrolled to my contacts. The moment the call connected, I spoke. "It's happening now." On the other end, the voice of my attorney, John Carter, came through, steady and controlled. "Stay calm. I'm on my way." I hung up, exhaling slowly, realizing that everything that had been simmering beneath the surface of my family had finally cracked open for everyone to see. The years of silence, the excuses, the favoritism, all of it had been leading to this exact moment. I leaned against my car and looked back through the glass doors of the hall. Inside, I could still see Mom standing on the stage, her expression unreadable, while Dad stood beside her pretending nothing had happened. Ryan stayed seated, staring at his hands. The applause for the band resumed after a moment, but it sounded hollow. I sat in my car, the throbbing in my cheek fading slowly. For the first time, I felt an unfamiliar mix of pain and clarity. There was no going back after this, no way to unsee the truth of who they were. 20 minutes later, the doors of the hall swung open and every head turned as John entered. His presence carried the calm authority of someone who knew exactly why he was there. He walked to the center of the room, his suit unwrinkled, despite the tension that thickened the air. My parents stood frozen by the stage, their earlier confidence replaced by confusion. The music had already stopped. Conversations turned into whispers, then silence. John greeted the crowd politely, introducing himself as my attorney, his voice clear and steady. He placed a leather folder on the nearest table, opened it, and said he had come to clarify a legal matter concerning the ownership of a certain vehicle. His tone was composed but unyielding, every word cutting through the quiet. Mom's face stiffened. She stepped forward, smiling nervously as she insisted that this was all a misunderstanding, that the family was just celebrating, and emotions had gotten ahead of us. But John didn't even glance at her. He calmly raised a document stamped and signed and explained that the Tesla in question was registered solely under my name, purchased with my personal income, and fully insured under my own account. He stated that no transfer or shared ownership had ever been filed. Each sentence sounded heavier than the last. Dad stood still, his hands clenched at his sides, eyes darting between John and the guests, who were now whispering again. One woman quietly left her chair, followed by two others trying not to make eye contact as they slipped toward the exit. Ryan stared at the floor, pretending to adjust his cufflink, his face pale. The image of him earlier smug and certain was gone. He looked like a child caught in something too big for him to handle. John didn't prolong the moment. He simply turned to face the room and said in the calmest voice possible that the car in question belonged solely to Eden Grant. The sentence hung in the air, impossible to dispute. Nobody moved. Even the waiters had stopped refilling glasses. The air felt cold, like the night had suddenly shifted. Mom opened her mouth again, perhaps to plead or explain, but no sound came. Dad's eyes dropped, shoulders heavy, and for the first time in my life I saw defeat in his posture. Ryan whispered something under his breath, though I couldn't catch it. The silence that followed felt endless. I turned away, walked past the tables and the stunned faces, and pushed through the open doors. Behind me, I could still hear the low hum of murmurs, the faint echo of shoes against marble, and John's calm voice speaking to someone else. Outside, the night air felt sharp. I took one deep breath and kept walking, not once looking back. By the next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. At first, I thought it was work, a client crisis maybe. But when I saw hundreds of notifications across every platform, my stomach tightened. Someone at the party had posted the video. The title read, "The Tesla Slap." It showed everything: my mother's announcement, my father's reaction, the sound of his hand meeting my face, and the silence that followed. Within hours, the clip had exploded online. Millions of views, countless comments, endless debates about family loyalty, entitlement, and public humiliation. My name, my face, my life, everywhere. At first, I didn't know whether to feel humiliated or vindicated. The comments ranged from sympathy to outrage. "Stay strong, Eden. You didn't deserve that." "Parents like these ruin families." Others argued I should have handled it privately, as if that had ever been an option. The algorithms did their job too well. By noon, every news outlet in Los Angeles had picked up the story. Some blurred my face. Most didn't. By afternoon, the consequences began to unfold. My father's company, Grant Financial, faced immediate backlash. Major partners suspended contracts citing ethical concerns. Investors pulled out, employees resigned. My mother's social circle, the prestigious Women in Business Association, issued a quiet statement thanking her for past service and removing her from the board. In less than 24 hours, the image of our perfect family shattered. The house that once hosted charity galas and business dinners now sat behind closed curtains. Ryan didn't escape the fallout either. His so-called friends unfollowed him. Group chats went silent, and the girl he'd been bragging about ghosted him entirely. For the first time, he wasn't being protected or excused. He sent me a short text that read, "This got out of control." I didn't reply. I had nothing left to say to him. Meanwhile, my inbox overflowed with messages from strangers, hundreds, then thousands. Some were journalists asking for interviews. Others were people who had lived through similar things: daughters overlooked sons, disrespected siblings, blamed for standing up. They told me they cried watching the clip, that they finally felt seen. I read as many as I could, each one a reminder that pain shared publicly can ripple far beyond intention. In the middle of that chaos, my best friend Alicia Moore showed up at my door. She didn't knock twice. When I opened, she was holding 2 coffees and a calm expression that only someone who has known you for decades can have. She didn't ask how I was or what had happened. She just sat down on my couch, handed me a cup, and said quietly, You finally stood up for yourself." Her words sank deeper than she probably expected. I realized she'd seen every compromise I'd ever made, every time I kept silent for peace, every moment I let someone else take the spotlight because I didn't want conflict. That day, she didn't need to comfort me with long speeches or promises. Just sitting there drinking coffee in silence felt like a small victory. The internet had turned my private humiliation into public justice. Yet for the first time in years, I felt no shame. I hadn't planned to expose anyone, but maybe the truth had finally found a way out that I never could have managed on my own. 2 weeks later, someone knocked on my apartment door. The sound startled me because hardly anyone ever came by without calling first. I hesitated before opening it, expecting maybe a delivery. But when the door swung open, my parents stood there holding a bouquet of white lilies. The sight froze me in place. They looked older, smaller somehow, their confidence gone. Mom's eyes were red and Dad's posture was heavy, like the weight of everything that had happened had finally settled on his shoulders. For a moment, none of us spoke. Mom tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice breaking halfway through the word. Dad cleared his throat, gripping the flowers too tightly. "We thought we should come see you," he added, his tone stiff but uncertain. I stepped aside just enough for them to enter, more out of politeness than warmth. The apartment felt too quiet once the door closed. Mom placed the lilies on the counter. "They're your favorite," she said. I didn't correct her. They weren't. She just remembered wrong, as she often did. Dad took a deep breath and looked around as if trying to find a safe place to begin. "We've lost everything, Eden. The business is gone, the investors have pulled out, even the house might go next. We need your help to fix it." The words came out heavy, like stones being dropped one by one. I waited, letting the silence stretch until it was unbearable. "You didn't lose me," I finally said. "You threw me away." My voice didn't shake. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something colder and deeper, the quiet clarity that comes when you stop expecting change. Mom covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. She reached out, trying to take my hand. I stepped back, not out of cruelty, but because I no longer had the strength to pretend. Her fingers froze midair, the gesture hanging between us like a memory of something that no longer existed. Dad lowered his head. "We made mistakes," he said almost in a whisper. "We thought we were doing what was best for everyone." I looked at him, the man who had once decided what my future should look like, without ever asking me. "You were doing what was best for you," I said quietly. Mom wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "Please, Eden, we're still a family." I wanted to believe that, but the word no longer meant what it used to. Family had become something fragile, built on apologies that came too late, and trust that couldn't be rebuilt with flowers. A phone buzzed on the counter. It was mine. Ryan had sent a message. "I'll try to change." That was all it said. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, then turned it face down. There were no words left that could bridge the distance between us. Mom looked at me again, as if searching for one last sign of forgiveness. I couldn't give it. I walked to the door and opened it. They understood. Dad nodded slowly, guiding her out without another word. The lilies stayed behind, their scent too sweet for the room. When the door clicked shut, I leaned against it, exhaling slowly. My hands were steady. No anger, no tears, just a tired kind of peace. It was strange how final silence could feel. The world outside carried on, indifferent to the wreckage that had once been my family. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and stood in the quiet, realizing that sometimes survival doesn't come from holding on, but from finally letting go. 3 months later, my life had finally gone quiet. The chaos had faded, replaced by a calm that felt both unfamiliar and earned. Mornings began with coffee by the window instead of phone calls filled with tension. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt like mine. I had moved into a new apartment overlooking the city, not extravagant, but bright, open, and peaceful. It was the first space I'd ever chosen purely for myself. At work, things had changed quickly. The board of directors had recognized my performance over the past year, and I was promoted to oversee a larger regional branch. The offer came with a salary that once would have shocked even my parents. I didn't celebrate it with anyone. Instead, I spent the evening reviewing contracts, signing a final agreement that transferred full ownership of the shares my father had once held in Grant Financial to me. The irony wasn't lost. What he had built through control, I had reclaimed through independence. The media had long since moved on to newer scandals, leaving my name behind. I was grateful for that. Yet every now and then someone still sent messages thanking me for standing up for myself. It reminded me that the story had meant something beyond my family, that it had started conversations about respect, equality, and the boundaries children are allowed to set with their parents. Those small messages meant more than any headline. Ryan had finally found a job. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he was delivering packages for a local company, working long shifts, but managing on his own. It was the first time in his life he wasn't living off someone else's effort. I didn't reach out, though. I wished him well in silence. I had learned that forgiveness doesn't always require reunion. Sometimes it's enough to simply release resentment. Mom kept out of the public eye. After the story broke, she withdrew from her social circles and sold several properties. A friend mentioned she now volunteered quietly at a community center. Dad had retired early, his reputation too damaged to rebuild. The last time I saw a photo of him online, he looked smaller, tired, but maybe finally human. For years he had chased power. Now perhaps he understood the price of it. As for me, life moved forward. I began collaborating with John on a nonprofit project aimed at helping women gain financial independence, something neither of us had planned, but both cared about deeply. We spent weeks building its foundation, free workshops, mentorship programs, and partnerships with local businesses. John's calm professionalism balanced my drive, and for the first time in a long while, work didn't just mean survival, it meant purpose. On a quiet Friday evening, we hosted our first event. Dozens of women came, some uncertain, others determined. As I watched them take notes and ask questions, I realized I wasn't just helping them. I was helping the version of myself who once thought she had to earn love through obedience. That version was gone, now replaced by someone who finally understood that independence is not rebellion. It's respect for oneself. When the night ended, I lingered by the door as the last few attendees left, each one smiling with a new kind of hope. John handed me a folder and said, "You did good today." I smiled back. We both did. Driving home, the city lights flickered like quiet applause outside my window. I thought of everything I had lost and everything I had gained because of it. Sometimes peace doesn't arrive in forgiveness or reconciliation. Sometimes it comes when you finally stop looking for approval and start living on your own terms. Looking back, the night that broke me was the one that rebuilt me. It wasn't just a turning point, it was the night I stopped being afraid of being misunderstood. I had spent years chasing approval from people who mistook control for care, mistook silence for respect. But the moment I stood my ground, even when it meant standing alone, everything changed. That single act of defiance had torn my life apart, only to rebuild it on stronger ground. Sometimes I think about that night when I'm driving down the wide avenues of Los Angeles, the city lights sliding across the hood of my Tesla. The streets hum beneath me, and the skyline glows like a promise kept. The reflection on the windshield reminds me of how far I've come, how the girl who once trembled in her father's shadow now drives through the same city with quiet certainty. Every red light feels like a pause to breathe, not a warning to stop. Every turn carries a calm I once thought I'd never find. As I pass the glass towers, I see echoes of my old life, meetings where I wasn't heard, dinners where love came with conditions, choices that were never mine to make. but I no longer carry the bitterness. It's replaced by understanding. True respect, I've learned, isn't about submission or keeping peace at any cost. It's about knowing when your dignity matters more than your comfort, when silence becomes self-erasure, and when walking away is the only way to stay whole. Mom lives quietly now. After the fallout, she retreated from the spotlight, spending most of her days tending a small garden behind the house she once used for social events. Dad withdrew from public life too. His name no longer appears in magazines or financial reports, and though he once feared obscurity more than death, I think a part of him now finds peace in anonymity. My brother Ryan delivers packages around the city. I saw him once at a traffic light. He didn't see me, but there was something steady in his expression that I hadn't seen before, a kind of humility that looked a lot like freedom. I've stopped waiting for apologies or closure. The truth is, I don't need them anymore. The universe has its own quiet way of balancing things. The people who once tried to define my worth are now learning to redefine their own. There's no triumph in their downfall, only a strange kind of symmetry. One evening, after a long day at the office, I parked near the beach. The wind carried the scent of salt and dusk. I watched the waves roll in endless and patient, erasing footprints faster than they could be made. That's how healing works, I think, not as a sudden revelation, but as the slow rewriting of who you are. I sat there for a long time, my reflection faint on the car window, the city fading behind me, and whispered a thought that had taken years to understand. Respecting myself was never arrogance. It was survival. When I finally started the engine and pulled back onto the road, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. The skyline shimmered ahead, alive, forgiving, and infinite. Sometimes peace is the loudest revenge. True respect isn't built on obedience or family name. It's built on fairness, courage, and knowing when to walk away. I learned that self-worth doesn't come from approval, but from the quiet certainty that you deserve peace. Eden's story shows that real strength lies not in winning arguments or proving others wrong, but in choosing yourself when no one else does, and realizing that doing so is the beginning of freedom, not its end. Thank you for staying with my story until the very end. If you've ever had to choose between peace and approval, share your experience in the comments. Someone out there might be standing at the same crossroads tonight, unsure of which way to go. Your story might be the light that helps them